The air was dust and the wind was cruel. A city of 200,000 souls was built on speed and raw ambition. Everything was hurried wood. Every plank, every sidewalk, every roof shingle was bone dry, waiting. On a Sunday night in October, the wind picked up the scent of tinder and started to whisper. 9 o'clock. De Koven Street. It began in a small barn, straw and kindling, and the dark quiet of an animal shifting on its feet. The first sound was a fast, hungry hiss. The kind of sound that means the air itself has become fuel. The fire did not crawl. It stood up tall, found the wind, and launched itself across the alley. Across the street. Across the next street. A thing of splintered wood and coal smoke, an impossible heat. Men ran toward the flames carrying buckets. The lake was only blocks away. But the fire was not waiting for water. It was a destiny claiming its city. The heat is gone now, buried under 100 years of steel and stone. But the timeline remains, etched deep into the city's memory. We follow the minute-by-minute account of that terrible, necessary night. Come with us now into the furnace. The clock stood at 9:30. Not even an hour had passed. The flames were already a beacon, but the city's eyes were slow. The alarm system was simple and fatally flawed. It required a human hand to pull the lever. The watchman Michael Ahern saw the glow. He saw the fire devouring the O'Leary property. But in the confusion of the dark, he saw wrong. He ran to box 342, 2 full blocks to the north of the true blaze, and pulled the alarm. Precious minutes bled away. The fire department was sent on a ghost chase, racing with exhausted horses and clanging bells to an empty street corner. Meanwhile, back on De Koven Street, the heat was already past counting. This was not a fire moving house to house. This was a continuous, shattering explosion. Chicago was not built to burn, it was built to explode. The air pressure alone was enough to make windows shatter blocks ahead of the flames. The wind, relentless and unforgiving, was driving sparks like flaming comets across vast distances. Every single roof in the path was a fuel canister, waiting for a single falling cinder to ignite. The men of the Chicago Fire Department had been fighting smaller fires for 3 days straight. Their resources were already paper-thin. They finally corrected the error and found the true location, but it was already too late for simple water. They hooked their hoses into hydrants, their powerful steam engines pumping desperately, but the sheer volume of flame was swallowing the water before it could even cool the air. The structures surrounding the origin point were disappearing, not burning down slowly. They were simply being consumed in a moment. The fire was 3 stories high, 100 yards wide, and moving like a train. Captain William Brown stood in the furnace light, watching everything he knew about fighting fires fail in front of him. This was not a domestic incident. This was a war against an element that had found its perfect ground. The nightmare turned official just before midnight. The fire had ripped through the working-class South Side and reached the river. The Chicago River. It was dark, sluggish, thick with commerce and filth, but it was wide. It was meant to be the uncrossable barrier, a final, wet shield between the neighborhood houses and the city's stone heart. But the heat did not respect water. The superheated air created a thermal column, a chimney that reached straight to the sky. It lifted immense timbers, glowing like embers, and carried them. They sailed 100 yards, 200 yards, clearing the waterway completely. It was like a fist of God throwing fire across the breach. The men on the north bank looked up. They saw the river, their supposed salvation, now only a black ribbon beneath a continuous shower of falling fire. The barrier was meaningless. When the sparks landed on the north side, they landed directly among the lumber yards. This was the city's true treasury, and its fatal flaw. The lumber yards of the North Side were a century's worth of cut, seasoned wood, a perfect, continuous supply of fuel. They were dry. They were packed tight against one another, a vast forest of death waiting to happen. It was the moment the fire stopped being a tragedy and became an extinction-level event. The flames had found the city's primary weakness, and they had found the wind again. The fire became something else entirely. It was a force that generated its own weather. And now, directly beyond the growing inferno of the lumber district, lay the beating, fragile heart of the city itself. It was a short, unstoppable march to the downtown, the financial institutions, the grand hotels. But most terrifyingly, in the direct line of the advancing wall of fire, lay the critical pumping station. This single building, thin-walled and vulnerable, supplied every drop of water for the entire DESP. Irate effort. If that station fell, the fire department would be left with nothing but empty hoses. The entire city was about to become powerless against its own terrible fate. And the fire was getting closer. The final hour was upon them. The final hour was upon them. The pumping station stood on the lakefront, a thin-walled sentinel of brick and iron. It was the last defense, and it was indefensible. Every fireman, every desperate citizen who had hoped to douse the spreading stain of ash, relied on the continuous, rhythmic beat of the giant steam engines within. If that beat stopped, the water pressure dropped to zero. A city fighting a terrible, self-generated storm with buckets would be left with nothing but empty hoses and prayer. The pumping station could not be sacrificed. But the fire, having consumed the lumber yards in a spectacular, instantaneous rage, was now a continuous, horizontal blast furnace aimed directly at the station's walls. The heat was not merely hot. It was a physical force, a wall of energy that broke glass and vaporized paint yards before the actual flame arrived. The engineers inside worked in a choking, impossible heat, their skin blistered by the radiating power of the firestorm they were trying to ignore. They were bound by duty to the massive, sweating machinery. Every revolution of the flywheel was a defiant breath taken by the city itself. As the pumping station stood alone in its doomed fight, the terrifying realization of the river crossing spread into the city's heart. This was the financial district. This was the center of power. Chicago had built itself on the arrogance of granite, stone, and iron, on the belief that its wealth made it immune to the frailties of lesser, wooden cities. The grand buildings of LaSalle Street, the massive banks, the temples of commerce, they were meant to be permanent. The city's elite watched from high windows, convinced the fire would respect their property lines, that their stone facades would resist the onslaught. They were profoundly, fatally wrong. The fire, now a vortex generating its own weather, did not respect stone. It respected only fuel. It jumped from structure to structure, bypassing the ground floors built to last a century, finding the dry wooden cornices, the paper-choked offices, and the forgotten infrastructure. The massive architectural barriers, meant to divide and isolate flames, only served to channel the heat, turning canyons of commerce into convection ovens. Panic became organized chaos, and the scramble began. The fight was no longer for lives, not yet but for the soul of the city, the records, the ledgers, the money. In every bank, cartmen struggled under the weight of iron safes, racing to drag them into the supposed safety of the open streets. Lawyers frantically loaded irreplaceable files onto drays. Every firm, every merchant, every judge was fighting to save the evidence of their identity. They created mountains of paper in the streets, paper the fire would later consume like kindling. The gutters soon held loose gold coins and scattered legal documents, overlooked for the larger, more desperate prize. All the while, the streets themselves became a terrifying labyrinth of screaming citizens, collapsing order, and the sickening clatter of brick giving way to cinder. But the real focus, the pivot point of the entire disaster, remained the pumping station. The fire had arrived. The windows shattered in unison, the glass exploding outward as the pressure differential became too great. Then came the heavy timber. A final massive piece of flaming debris, carried on the firestorm's own wind, smashed through the wooden-framed roof. It landed directly beside the vital, exposed steam engine flywheel. It was a mortal wound. The engineers made a final, desperate charge to contain the new, internal fire, beating at the inferno with anything they could find. But the wooden supports, the vital mechanisms that moved the water, began to catch. The massive engine strained. It coughed a terrible metal sound of exhaustion. The steady, life-giving beat of the city's heart faltered. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the fire. The pressure gauge on the wall began its terrible, unstoppable slide toward zero. The entire effort, the entire battle, was about to run dry. And the hose teams on the front lines knew it. The men felt it before they heard it. The hose, once rigid and alive in their grasp, went suddenly soft. A terrible slackness. The water jet, which had been a solid, resisting pillar of force, disintegrated into a stuttering, desperate cough. A brief spray of steam, then nothing. The nozzle, a vital tool only seconds ago, became a dead, useless weight. On the street, the chief's raw, constant engine of command broke. His throat was suddenly dry. All physical, rhythmic, desperate effort of the last 12 hours ceased. An unnatural silence fell over the fire lines, a silence more immediate, more chilling thaw. And the fire's own tremendous roar. It was the heavy sound of defeat, the moment the human will faltered and surrendered the stage to nature. They looked back toward the lake, toward the now useless pumping station, and saw only a dense, oily black smoke, an iron funeral shroud settling over the city's vital heart. The fire did not hesitate. It saw its opportunity. Without the counterforce of pressurized water, the sheer, unimaginable heat radiating from the conflagration became immediately and exponentially unstoppable. This was no longer just a terrestrial fire. It had become a localized weather system. The massive convection column, the central column of superheated, rising air, now unopposed, transformed into a terrifying turbine. It began sucking in the cooler air from the lake at a terrifying, focused velocity. The wind became a weapon in the fire's hand. Hotter than 1,000 industrial ovens, it carried embers the size of fists across entire city blocks, igniting buildings not from the bottom up, but from the roof down, in a terrifying shower of hellish confetti. Men who had stood firm against walls of flame now broke and ran. The fear was no longer that their building would burn down the street. The fear was the sheer speed of consumption. The fire was moving north now, a relentless 20-mile-per-hour stampede of pure, unstoppable consumption. The South Division was utterly lost. The only remaining question was if the North Division could be saved. Chicago was geographically a city split by water. The main branch of the Chicago River curved like a terrible, defensive moat between the burning commercial core and the wealthier, densely built north side. It should have been a barrier. It should have been the clear, final line of defense. But the wind, that terrible, unnatural wind, mocked the geography. It pushed the fire's advance toward the few, narrow, wooden bridges, the only immediate escape routes remaining. A new wave of desperate citizens, those who had lingered too long to save precious belongings, realized their fate was sealed if they remained south of that dark, oil-slicked water. They streamed north, merging with the initial rush of those fleeing the burning business district. The wooden bridges, Kinsey Street, Rush Street, became suddenly clogged, solid masses of terrified humanity, horses, carts laden with salvaged memories, all fighting for the narrow span. A single, unified, screaming rush for survival. The weight alone threatened to buckle the aged timbers beneath their feet. But the fire did not wait for the bridges to clear. The convection column, now fully energized, became a siege engine. It was estimated that a 1,000-degree blast of air, carrying sheets of flaming paint and whole sections of splintered roof, landed simultaneously on the northern bank. The North Division had been safe for only a few terrible minutes. The bridge structures themselves, heavy with pitch and decades of wear, began to smoke, then ignite. Below, the river burned. Oil and waste floating on the surface caught the intense heat, turning the water into a gutter of liquid fire. The moat had failed. The main fire, which had consumed the entire commercial center, had now made the impossible leap. A handful of men stood on the northern edge of the Rush Street Bridge, looking back at the wall of impossible, roaring destruction, and they knew. The city was no longer just a city burning. It was now two separate, doomed islands, the one already consumed and the one about to be. The fire had crossed the river, and there was no turning back, no hope of containment left. Chicago had become an island of flame. The truth of the fire was its physics. It did not simply burn, it prepared the way. The heat that crossed the river was not just a spark. It was the advance guard of a heat wave so intense it caused the air itself to become a kind of fuel. The North Division was home. It was a wide, sprawling neighborhood of grand, new mansions and tightly packed worker cottages, all built of the same inexpensive, doomed timber. Where the south side was commerce, the north side was simply fuel, ready and waiting. The first structures to fall near the bridgeheads did not smolder or hesitate. They turned instantly to towers of flame. The fire moved inland from the river, eating entire blocks in less time than it took a man to run their length. The fire marshal, now just a ghost covered in soot and disbelief, watched his only defense line evaporate into a gutter of molten tar. His department had fought for 14 hours straight, without rest, without water, chasing phantoms in the distant South Loop. Their exhausted horses could barely walk. Their hose lines were shredded and useless. The water pressure, already dwindling from a dozen broken mains, became nothing more than a desperate hiss. The final companies did not retreat in any orderly fashion. They simply dissolved. Each surviving fireman became a single, desperate Feig. Ray fighting for his own family or his nearest neighbor, knowing that the city had already fallen past saving. The organized defense of Chicago was over. The battle was now a rout. The new wave of panic that swept the north side was different from the first. In the initial hours, people had run to the bridges, to the hope of a crossing. Now, the bridges were burning behind them, great pyres marking the final boundary of the lost city. There was only one direction left, north. A mile-wide column of humanity began pushing relentlessly toward the open prairie past Lincoln Park. This was not an orderly procession of refugees. It was a stampede across a burning fuse. The streets became unrecognizable nightmares of chaos and sudden, deadly heat. Carriages overturned, their wheels aflame. Treasured possessions, heavy pianos, ornate mirrors, chests of drawers filled with heirlooms, were abandoned and immediately incinerated, cluttering the path for those struggling behind. The roar was no longer just the sound of the wind. It was the sound of 1,000 separate buildings collapsing in unison, a deep, terrible bass note beneath the high-pitched screams of the trapped. In the center of this new maelstrom on the western lakefront stood a building that was, in truth, the only thing keeping the city alive. The Chicago Water Pumping Station. It was a grand stone fortress, the operational heart of the city's ability to fight back. Its massive engines drew water from the lake and fed the vital pressure to every remaining hydrant in the city. Its survival was the only variable left in the equation of ruin. The fire, having devoured the entire central and commercial district, having conquered the river, now turned its singular, focused gaze toward this final, critical target. It did not require a blast or a powerful spark to do its work. It required only time. And the path to the waterworks was clear. A dense line of wood-framed buildings, kindling ready for the match, stood between the roaring wall and the stone pumping house. The few firemen left in the vicinity, men too tired to weep, looked at the encroaching glow and knew the terrible calculus. If the pumping station fell, the entire city would become a dry, defenseless furnace. Every single hydrant would go silent. The entire water-based defense would cease to exist. The fire was now 100 yards away, 50 yards. The heat was blinding, the air too thick to draw a full breath. Chicago was not just losing a battle to a flame. It was about to lose its voice, its power, and its only remaining hope. The silence of the hydrants would be the true end of the city. The fire advanced, a hungry god on a collision course with the only thing that could stop it. The clock ran down to 0. The fire did not hesitate. It devoured the last 50 yards of dry lumber in a single, roaring breath. The stone walls of the waterworks were an island, but the stone was not proof against the sky. Embers, superheated and incandescent, rained down in a blinding shower. They found the roof. A wooden dome, sealed with tar, it was never designed for this hell. Smoke came first, black and thick, rising in a futile, oily column. Then the orange maw opened high above. The men inside, the engineers who had run these great engines for a decade, they knew the sound of failure before the collapse even finished. The roof gave way in a thundering, terrible shudder. The fire had landed inside the final fortress. The boilers screamed a final time. Steam filled the chamber, blinding and scalding, a desperate final defense. But then a sound far more terrifying than the roar of the blaze took hold, the slowing. The rhythmic, mechanical heart of Chicago began to stutter. The great brass and steel pistons, which had pushed 1,000,000 gallons of water every hour, began to seize and drag. A final shudder, a wrenching grind. Then silence. Not the silence of peace, but the deafening void where hope used to live. At 4 o'clock in the morning, October 9, 1871, the Chicago water pumping station was an engine room no more. It was a ruin. Across the river, in the vast, wooden neighborhoods of the North Division, the realization hit with the force of a physical blow. The pressure dropped. Fire hoses went limp in the hands of the exhausted men. A fireman holding a nozzle watched the desperate stream die to a sickly trickle, then nothing at all. A silence swept over the defense lines, a new, terrible sound that erased the noise of the panic itself. They knew the hydrants had gone quiet. The men fighting the fire were suddenly just men fighting air. The city's organized response vanished in that moment. Authority dissolved into ash and dust. This was no longer a battle, it was a rout. People who had stayed, clinging to the belief that the waterworks were impenetrable, now turned to flee with a new, panicked desperation. They poured onto the streets, not the neat, orderly exodus they had imagined, but a tide of human terror crashing against itself, its velocity governed only by fear. And ahead of the fleeing crowd lay the North Division. Miles of new wealth, miles of dense working-class homes, miles of fresh kindling. The North Division was a world unto itself, a wooden labyrinth, home to 300,000 souls. The only barrier left was the river, now a steaming, conquered trench, easily bridged by the wind. The fire had crossed the border of the city's heart and was entering its body. Nothing in its path was stone, Nothing in its path was metal, only wood, only air. The wind, which had guided the flame for 20 hours, now gained a terrible, focused strength. It had found its open field. The great engines of the city were dead. The sun was not yet up. It would rise upon a horror no human mind could yet comprehend. The fire turned north, away from the dead heart toward the living. It became a wall, a mile wide, 100 feet high, a judgment rendered in flame. Chicago had lost its water. Now it would lose everything else. The destruction had just begun. The night of October 9th did not simply continue. It deepened its hold on the world. The flame had crossed the Chicago River not by bridge, but by sheer, organized air power. It lifted embers like cannon shot, spanning the 400 feet of water as easily as a stone skipping across a pond. It struck the wharves and lumberyards on the North Shore. The kindling was dry, ancient, and stacked high. This was the death stroke. The sound was no longer the roar of a single fire. It was the sound of 1,000 blacksmiths hammering the end of the world. The North Division stretched for miles, a vast, complex maze of 2- and 3-story structures. It was a district built in the rush to greatness, hasty, cheap, and entirely of wood. Every porch was a fuse. Every fence was a path. Every boardwalk was a trail of powder. The fire found the seams where the cheap lumber met, and it moved with a velocity that defied all natural law. It did not burn block by block here. It moved across the rooftops, finding the structural gaps, leaping 20 yards with a single breath of the gale. It became less a ground fire and more a storm of falling flame, dropping from the sky onto the trapped population. For the 300,000 souls caught north of the river, there was suddenly only one direction of flight: away from the lake, away from the river, away from the core of the city. Their only hope lay in the great, open expanse of Lincoln Park, a green refuge many miles to the north, on the distant edge of the map. It became the only compass point that mattered. The streets, the avenues, the alleyways, they were designed for commerce, not for evacuation. They became impossible trenches of human despair. Wagons, panicked horses, half-dressed families, furniture saved in haste only to be abandoned moments later. Everything was an obstacle to survival. The order that governed the city's life had vanished. In its place was a primal surge. Wealth meant nothing. Poverty meant nothing. The only currency was velocity and the raw strength to push forward. The wind, now superheated, was not a force of nature but a predator. It created its own gravity, drawing the oxygen from the fleeing crowds and pushing the smoke before it as a choking curtain. Men looked back and saw not a district fire, but the collapse of an entire horizon. The air became a visible convection oven, melting the glass from the windows before the frames even caught fire. The entire sky had opened up, raining hot tar and burning timbers. In a district that had taken 20 years to build, the fire promised to erase every trace of human effort in 4 hours. This was the true horror of the North Division. There was no water to fight it. There was no authority to direct the people. There was only the fire itself, a moving, sentient wall of destruction, closing off every path to safety, guaranteeing that the path out would soon become a final, desperate crush of bodies. The flames were moving at a speed impossible to outrun. They did not chase the people, they simply prepared to overtake them. The citizens of the North Division had been told the fire was contained. They had been told the river was the final defense. They had been lied to by the cruel, indifferent geometry of the wind and the wood. Now that illusion was gone, and the great tragedy was not the burning of property, but the complete, crushing obliteration of hope. No help was coming. The next few hours would become the single most concentrated period of loss in American history. A battle for survival fought in the dark, where the only prize was a few extra minutes of air. The great crush was beginning. The human cost was about to be tallied. The air itself was no longer breathable atmosphere. It was a suffocating soup of charcoal dust and searing heat, forced down the throats of everyone running north. Panic, that most contagious of human contagions, was now the only master. It did not speak, it only pushed. The order that had defined Chicago's streets, the polite grid of its commerce, vanished instantly. Everything that remained was animal instinct, stripped bare. Fathers lost sons in the torrent of bodies. Women, carrying the weight of their family's entire existence in a stolen pillowcase, were dragged down by the crush. The fire did not simply burn the wood, it inhaled it, and where the wood was, the people fled. There was only one direction that mattered now, west, toward the river. A river that had promised safety for decades now became the final, impossible bottleneck. The bridges, Rush Street, Clark Street, State Street, were not crossings, they were choke points of desperation. Every soul in the North Division was now attempting to funnel itself through a handful of narrow openings at the same moment. The great tragedy was that the crush was not caused by the fire directly, but by the desperate, simultaneous movement of people trying to escape its coming. In the dark, the pathetic inventory of their lives became a death sentence. Trunks full of silver, clocks, portraits, the useless, heavy anchors of a world that no longer existed, they were discarded on the pavements. The weight of remembrance became too heavy a price for one more step. The cobblestones, only hours before trod by businessmen and lovers, were now carpeted with the broken remnants of domestic life. A porcelain doll, a half-packed satchel, a prayer book scorched black by the ambient heat. Chicago was not just burning its buildings, it was burning its history piece by piece under the fleeing feet of its inhabitants. The fire's heat was so intense it created its own wind, a gale that tore at the clothes and whipped the smoke into blinding spirals. Windows exploded from the pressure, showering the streets with razor-sharp shards of glass, yet no one stopped. To stop meant to be overtaken. To stop meant to be left behind. And for those who reached the bridges, a different horror awaited. The wooden spans were choked solid, a living carpet of humanity locked shoulder to shoulder. The roar of the conflagration was now joined by the sickening, high-pitched scream of hundreds of voices crushed together, fighting for inches. Ahead of them, the main city seemed to be burning in solidarity, throwing an orange glare across the churning, oily blackness of the river. Behind them, the fire's sound was a colossal, grinding storm, tearing the roofs from the buildings they had just left. The river below offered a grim choice: the impossible heat of the packed crowd or the immediate, frigid surrender to the water. Some chose the water. They lowered themselves down the pilings, only to be drowned in the dark currents, exhausted and pulled under by the weight of their soaked woolen clothes. Most stayed on the bridges, praying that the slow, millimeter-by-millimeter slide toward the opposite shore would deliver them to safety. Their prayers were answered only by the physics of the gale. Then came the moment that turned panic into pure, geological despair. A spark, a piece of wind-driven flaming debris, what eyewitnesses called a firebrand, landed not in the water and not in the buildings, but directly onto the packed, dry timber of the Rush Street Bridge itself. The crowd, already immobilized, watched in frozen terror as the narrow escape route began to smoke. The river, the last defense, was about to become the final burning trap. The geography of their escape had betrayed them. They were sealed in. The fire was no longer just chasing them. It was now positioned to consume them completely, cornered between the smoke and the sea of flame. The bridge became a pyre. The fire had found the last dry timber. It did not creep, it exploded. Tar and oil, soaked into the centuries of bridge repairs, turned the roadway into a horizontal chimney, venting smoke directly into the faces of the trapped. The wood groaned, a living sound, as the internal structure began to fail. To stay was to burn. The only escape was the 15-foot drop into the darkness below. A new type of scream rose from the packed humanity, the sound of a terrible realization, not panic. They were forced into the air. Dozens simply surrendered to the fall, trusting the black water to be a kinder executioner than the heat. Women, clutching children, slid down the thick ropes of the mooring lines until their hands bled raw. Below, the river's surface was no longer a mirror reflecting the city's ruin. It was a boiling, churning drain of debris and sinking bodies, lit by the terrible illumination from above. The heat became a physical wall, pushing the jumpers away from the relative safety of the western bank and back toward the inferno. Yet the real tragedy was not the bridge itself. The bridge was merely a piece of kindling in a larger, unstoppable process. The wind, the true master of this disaster, was lifting the massive burning fragments, the firebrands, high above the screaming crowds. It treated the Chicago River, that black ribbon of protection, with contempt. It lofted the burning shingle and the blazing timber, carrying them hundreds of yards across the water. The first sparks fell onto the North Division. This was the city's heart of industry, the repository of everything Chicago had built its wealth on. Here lay the vast lumberyards, the millions of feet of drying pine and cedar, stacked 50 feet high and waiting for the mill. When the first brand landed in the sawdust and dry timber, there was no slow burn. There was immediate geological consumption. The North Division was a tinderbox built on ambition. It was the land of grand mansions and affluent avenues, but they were constructed with the same flimsy, balloon-frame speed as the shanties they replaced. Pine structures, dried by the summer sun and now fed by the relentless southwesterly gale, simply vaporized. The fire found the gas lines. The gas lines found the immense, flammable stores of whiskey and oil and coal. The wind had been clocked at 40 miles per hour, and the fire itself began to create its own separate, higher-velocity wind. A firestorm was born, a circular vortex of heat and suction, tearing up pavement and throwing flaming beams through the air like artillery shells. This was no longer a contained event. It was the complete, atmospheric unraveling of a metropolis. A mile of solid city could now be consumed in 10 minutes. The people trapped north of the river had believed their distance was their security. Now, they learned the opposite truth. The further the fire spread, the faster it moved, and the more total the resulting destruction. They had minutes, perhaps an hour, before the inferno they had watched across the river would turn around and devour their homes. In the South Division, the battle had been lost to the simple geometry of the grid and the overwhelming might of the gale. But the loss in the North Division was an execution. It meant the end of organized resistance, because the flames were now driving directly for the most critical infrastructure the city possessed. The massive public works facility and, critically, the pumping station that drew water from Lake Michigan. If that structure fell, if the fire reached the machinery that supplied every hose, every steam engine, every drop of defense, then the entire city would be surrendered to the blaze. It was only a matter of time now. The flames were coming, and soon the people of Chicago would be forced to face the final, inevitable truth. They were about to lose their last line of defense, and the water would stop. The pumping station stood at the lake's edge, a fortress of limestone and iron, a heavy sentinel against the relentless storm. Inside its walls, the massive twin engines pulsed, a mechanical heart pumping the city's very lifeblood. Its purpose was singular: to defy thirst, to defy fire. Now it was the final target. The engineers and the few exhausted firemen assigned to its defense knew the futility of their stand. They could see the column of flame, a roaring, living thing, consuming the blocks separating it from their machine. This structure, designed only to manage the flow of water, was about to be destroyed by the very heat that water was supposed to conquer. Every steam-driven piston, every turning crank, became a clock measuring the seconds left to the metropolis. The people of the North Division, who had woken up believing the river was an insurmountable moat, felt the heat turn from a distant threat to a physical weight on their backs. The roar was no longer just sound. It was a physical pressure against their chests. The time for careful decisions had vanished. There was no time to pack, only time to grab. A forgotten doll, a massive roll-top desk, a silver tea set, a box of irreplaceable ledgers. Objects that suddenly contained the entire weight of a family's history were either clutched tightly or abandoned to the smoke. The grand, tree-lined avenues of the North Side, which had represented Chicago's wealth and future, became choking, congested arteries of panicked flight. They were all running now. They ran toward the perceived sanctuary of the open ground in Lincoln Park, seeking any space that was not solid construction, any breath of air not already laced with soot and fire. Carriages overturned, blocking the escape route. People walked in a daze, shielding their eyes from the airborne embers. They were fleeing the fire, but they could not take their eyes off the station. Every backward glance was fixed on the massive plumes of steam and the insistent, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the pumps, knowing that when that sound finally died, the chance of saving anything at all would die with it. The end came not with a slow, grinding surrender, but with explosive, shocking speed. The heavy timber roof of the superstructure, dried to a fine tinder by weeks of drought and superheated by the wind, offered virtually no resistance to the flame. It caught, not block by block, but all at once. The iron-framed windows shattered inward from the radiant heat, and flames, like liquid light, poured over the masonry and onto the machinery below. The engineers, trapped inside the cavernous pumping hall, had one final, impossible duty: to keep the pistons driving, to shovel coal, to feed the insatiable furnaces until the last possible second. But metal, now impossibly hot, began to warp and groan. The great leather drive belts that connected the engines to the lake intakes hissed, buckled, and snapped like pistol shots. Finally, the main roof structure, built to withstand any natural storm, collapsed onto the great water wheel, and the main intake pipes with a final, crushing sound that was instantly swallowed by the surrounding firestorm. The machine that had given Chicago life was finally, definitively dead. For a brief, impossible moment, the sound of the entire city changed. Across the miles of burning avenues, a single, high-pitched scream cut through the din. The frantic, final gasp of the steam engine safety valve, the ultimate, dying release of pressure from the machine's boilers. And then there was only the fire. In the hands of every fireman across every division, south, central, and now north, the pressure in the hoses dropped. The jets of water, which had been the only fragile connection to hope, weakened. They sputtered, they coughed, and with an awful certainty they died. It did not fade to a trickle. It simply ceased. The silence of the pipes, the absence of the rush and the hiss, was more terrifying than any roar of the flames. In that moment, Chicago was no longer fighting a fire. It was simply waiting. The city had surrendered its last line of defense. The city had no water. The flames were coming now, and there was nothing left to stop them. This was the true turning point. Not the first spark, nor the first roof to fall, but this chilling, final silence in the pipes. The fire had been momentarily held back by human effort, a terrible fight of attrition against an elemental enemy. Now, the battle was definitively over, and the flames knew it. They did not slow. Instead, they seemed to inhale the sudden vacuum of the air with a savage sigh. The crackle became a profound, rhythmic roar, deeper and more menacing than any sound Chicago had ever known. The firemen, covered in soot and sweat, stood frozen, their hoses limp at their feet like dead snakes. The tools of their trade, now utterly useless, were dropped onto the cobblestones, the sound muffled by the growing conflagration. They had nothing left to aim at the growing mountain of red heat. They were just men, watching a god consume their world. The surrender was psychological before it was physical. The will to fight broke. The panic, which had been simmering beneath the veneer of organized response, now burst forth like steam from a severed pipe. Across the Great South Division, the movement of people changed from an orderly retreat to a desperate, unthinking sprint. The focus was no longer on saving the city, but on saving oneself. The heat was now impossible, radiating through solid brick walls, turning the very air into a searing medium. Buildings simply combusted, not from flame, but from proximity. And still the wind blew. It was the other unseen enemy that night, whipping in relentlessly from the southwest, a great gale low over the prairie. The vast, incandescent heat had begun to create its own terrible weather system, a vacuum of air rushing inward toward the center of the inferno. This was not just heat, it was a physical force, a monstrous bellowing lung. As the fire inhaled, it began to exhale. High above the street, the air itself was now a superheated river of fire, carrying millions of incandescent sparks, shards of glass, and pieces of burning wood. These were not mere ashes, they were flaming projectiles hurled miles ahead of the main front. The fire was no longer confined to the ground. It was flying. Roofs a quarter-mile away that had been untouched suddenly erupted, not from the advancing line of fire but from the heavens. The rain had ceased months ago, leaving everything brittle and dry, but now a new rain began to fall. A rain of fire carried on the relentless gale. The only thing left to resist was the Chicago River. It was the city's great watery moat, the final natural line of defense against total annihilation. 100 feet wide, deep, and flowing with the murky industrial current. The South Division was nearly gone. The Central Division, the heart of the commerce and the dense slums, was already beginning to melt into ruin. But beyond the water, the North Division stood, home to the city's grandest mansions, the opulent streets of the elite, the final sanctuary where many had fled. P clung to that gap, to that 100 feet of moving water. But the river was merely another obstacle to this new, demonic force. The flying embers, superheated and carried by the gale, began to make the impossible journey. They fell onto the great wooden pivot bridges that spanned the river, and the dry, oily timber caught instantly. The bridges became long, flaming fuses, burning from both the middle and the shore. The air above the river became an oven, and when the truly impossible happened, there was no sound except the crushing roar of the wind and the groan of snapping timber. A massive, burning piece of cornice, caught by the updraft and hurled like a flaming spear, landed squarely on the roof of a lumberyard on the north side shore. Instantly, the carefully curated stock of dry pine and cedar exploded into an impossible pillar of light. The fire had crossed the Chicago River. The final frontier had been breached. The last, impossible hope was gone. The grand, quiet streets of the North Division, where families had watched the flames thinking they were safe, suddenly had the inferno at their throats. The disaster was no longer an approaching event. The disaster had arrived. The city was now a crucible. The noise was no longer a distant, hungry roar. It was a close, intimate, terrible sound, the sound of destruction taking root. For 5 hours, the families of the North Division had watched the glow across the river. They watched from their grand windows, across their wide, manicured lawns, with a feeling of distant, superior pity. The fire was a tragedy, yes, but it was a South Side tragedy. Now the air was suddenly thick with ash, not fine gray particles, but fist-sized chunks of flaming roof shingle and heavy timber. The light was not red anymore. It was the white-hot light of a blast furnace. The grand, quiet streets, lined with the city's most expensive homes, went from calm to absolute anarchy in under 10 minutes. The North Division was built for permanence and display, not for survival. These were not the flimsy shanties of the workers. These were 3-story palaces of dry walnut and seasoned oak, fitted with heavy drapes and filled with priceless, highly combustible furniture. When the fire arrived, it found limitless fuel. A house did not catch fire slowly. It exploded into light, a sudden, complete surrender. The distance between one mansion and the next was nothing to this thermal hurricane. The fire did not creep, it vaulted. Disbelief became a crushing, physical panic. The city's wealthiest citizens, those who had always believed their money could buy them immunity, now faced the brutal reality that wealth was only weight. The carriage houses emptied, but the escaping families did not grab bread and water. They seized silver plate, family portraits ripped violently from the wall, and heavy, carved mahogany boxes. A desperate, foolish attempt to carry status out of the doom. The streets instantly jammed with fine, lumbering carriages, driven by men yelling for the right of way. But there was no right of way, only a crushing bottleneck. $1,000 worth of gilded goods suddenly became a terrible, inescapable burden, clogging the only escape routes. The fire's pace was beyond human comprehension. It was being fed now by vast lumberyards that lined the lake shore, transforming from dry wood into instantaneous columns of impossible black light that drove the wind faster, further. The only remaining direction was north. The people ran for Lincoln Park. They believed that the vast, open grass and the scattered trees of the park could not burn. They believed the water of the immense lake, the great border of the entire city, would protect their flank. They were wrong on every count. Miles ahead of the actual flame line, the superheated gale created a rain of fire. When the refugees reached the sanctuary of the park, the trees above them were already catching fire. The park was not a shield. It became an oven of shared terror. The elite, the merchants, the laborers, everyone who had fled from every division of the city, met on the narrow strip of shore at the lake's edge. Social structures, class distinctions, and manners dissolved in the crushing roar of the approaching fire. There was no more city to run to. There was only the lake. They pressed forward, thousands upon thousands, pushing to the edge of the world they knew, seeking the final, unbreachable barrier of water. They stood on the narrow, tar-soaked piers, watching the city they knew become a single, coherent mountain of flame behind them. But the fire followed. It had already defied the river. Now it focused on the lake. The wooden pilings of the docks, dry and saturated with pitch, caught instantly, burning from below the surface of the water, turning the platforms into terrifying, narrow furnaces jutting into the black, cold void. The crowd had escaped the city of wood and stone only to be peeped by the city of water and smoke. They stood at the final boundary, looking out at the endless, indifferent blackness of Lake Michigan. The choices were gone. The hour of reckoning had arrived. Stand and burn or step into the abyss. They looked at the lake. It was not a friend. It was an indifferent blackness, too cold, too deep, and without the slightest promise of rescue. The air around them was now a solid, vibrating wall of sound, the collective shriek of every joist, every plank, every pane of glass in a million structures being ripped apart by heat. The only way to move was forward, away from the terrifying pressure on their backs, and into the only space left. They had sought the edge of the world, and now they had found it. The lucky few were those who scrambled onto the deck of anything that floated, tugs, small barges, even overturned lifeboats. These few dozen vessels became tiny, bobbing arcs in the colossal furnace of the docks. But there was no room for everyone, and the rule of law had ended hours ago. In its place, the brutal rules of physics and simple math took over. Survival was now measured in kilograms of weight and inches of free deck space. On the narrow, smoking gunnels of the barges, men fought men. Neighbors pushed neighbors. The distinction between the saved and the damned was made in a single, desperate movement. Those who were pushed or slipped into the water did not surface again, swallowed by the polluted darkness beneath the piers. For the thousands who remained trapped on the rapidly burning platforms, the horizon offered no escape. They were a captive audience for the absolute, final, triumphant light of the fire. The great beast was not yet finished with the city. It was not concerned with the few souls escaping on the water. It wanted everything left behind. The piers, soaked in pitch and dried by the year-long drought, dissolved entirely, turning the dock line into a continuous ribbon of absolute light. But the fire needed one more thing. It needed to cross the final, open space of clear land, the last true gap between the South and North divisions. It did not leap the river. Instead, it weaponized the air itself. Driven by a heat no human had ever witnessed, a massive, superheated column rose above the core of the inferno. It was not a pillar of smoke. It was pure, radiating heat, pulling air from every direction in an attempt to feed itself. In that moment, the fire tornado, an elemental judgment, was born. This immense, rising column of heat created a vacuum. It was the only force stronger than the prevailing southwest wind. The steady gale that had pushed the fire toward the lake, providing a clear path of escape for those to the north, now faltered. And then, with a grinding, sickening inevitability, the wind reversed. The new current was manufactured by the fire itself, a destructive gift to its own continuation. The vast, deadly front, momentarily held at the water's edge, swung around like a colossal, living scythe. It was no longer aimed at the lake. It was now aimed directly back at the city's unburned, untouched flank. The few hundred acres of the wealthy North Division, the mansions, the stone churches, and the final, beautiful parks, stood directly in the path of this new, impossible apocalypse. The residents there, who had sheltered family and watched the south side burn from their rooftops with grim assurance, realized the horrible error in their calculus. The fire had not merely changed direction. It had successfully flanked the river, the lake, and every remaining hope of the people. The last true firebreak in the city, the blocks of brick and stone between the river and the Gold Coast, had just been rendered irrelevant. The great engine of destruction had discovered the final route in, and it began to move toward the city's last resting place. They looked up and saw not the old, familiar city, but a hellish mirror. The sky itself was raining fire a second time. The air itself was a convection oven, not merely smoke, but a tempest of burning cedar shingles and half-melted glass, lifted miles into the sky and dropped down onto the unwary. It was an assault by proxy. This was the city's burning heart striking its head. The fire did not need to cross the river below. It simply flew over it. It rained down on mansard roofs and wooden eaves, igniting dozens of separate, independent blazes deep within the district. These were not adjacent flames pushing block to block. They were explosions of sudden, impossible heat, miles from the main front. The defense was now shattered. For the residents of the North Division, the grim calculus was replaced by stark terror. They had prepared for an orderly retreat north. They had planned to wait, watching the monster burn itself out across the water. Now, the monster was everywhere, already inside their homes, attacking their stables and igniting the very trees in their immaculate parks. The last, best hope of the entire northern half of the city lay in a single, formidable structure. In the path of the new front stood the Chicago Water Tower and its pumping station, a Gothic symbol of the city's modern aspiration, built of solid limestone. The entire hope of the North Division, and any hope of saving even a fraction of the city, lay in the constant pressure this tower provided. If the pumps failed, the hoses would go limp. Every man with a nozzle in his hand would instantly become useless. The defense would collapse into a desperate scramble for personal survival. And now, the fire's own dark logic demanded its destruction. The grim assurance of the elite dissolved into a collective, primal scream. Carriages previously loaded with irreplaceable treasures, art, silver, documents, now became desperate, jammed vehicles for human escape. The streets of the Gold Coast, so perfectly manicured just hours before, became choked arteries of panic. The entire North Division, compressed into a narrow wedge by the lake and the river, was moving instinctively toward the only open ground left. They moved toward the lakefront and the prairie land far to the north, but even there, the fire anticipated them. The immense heat drew in the damp air off Lake Michigan, turning the escaping gale into a screaming cyclone of hot ash. The air was thick, suffocating. People fell in the streets, trampled by those who had lost the power of thought to the primal need for motion. They had to choose. The lake was an icy grave. The streets were an impassable knot of burning wood and panicked humanity. They moved instinctively to the few remaining bridges on the north side, hoping to escape the wedge, only to find them already burning. The fire had done its work perfectly. It had sealed the city's fate by hurting its victims. Inside the pumping station, a handful of engineers and laborers fought a battle of desperate futility. They were the final, tiny line of defense for a city already lost. They needed to keep the pressure up, to keep the massive steam engines running, but they were surrounded by an encroaching inferno. The roof began to crack. The heat was so intense it warped the heavy iron machinery inside, making the pumps groan in protest. The battle had become elemental, man against fire's pure, unstoppable hunger. The light outside the tall, arched windows of the water tower was no longer daylight, or even the familiar hue of a distant blaze. It was the white-hot glare of total incineration. The glass exploded inward. A fire line cannot hold without water, and the city was watching its final, beautiful engine of life turn to ash. The moment of failure was not a slow decline or a gradual drop in pressure. It was a sudden, final, terrifying silence. The silence was the sound of a city expiring. The mighty pumps, the engines of life that had thrummed for decades, were instantly and irrevocably dead. Only the white-hot roar of the surrounding conflagration filled the space. The engineers stood in the molten wreckage, their faces blackened, their lungs searing. They were not defeated by a battle, but by a force of nature that cared nothing for brick or steel. They staggered out, stumbling past the arched doors of the station, turning their backs on the smoking ruin of their responsibility. They had failed to save the machine. Now they could only stand witness to the end of everything. The water tower, the sentinel of the north side, the beautiful, proud structure that had come to symbolize the city's unyielding ambition, began to glow. Its limestone was superheated. The heat was so profound, so absolute, that the rock itself seemed to liquefy. The heavy, protective stone began to split with a sound like massive thunder. It was not a gentle crumble. It was the sudden, violent shattering of a monument. The roof folded in on itself, and the final, beautiful symbol of Chicago's resistance vanished in a pillar of flame. The fire had won the final battle. It had silenced the water, and it had consumed the stone. Now nothing was left to slow it. The inferno had expanded far past the boundaries of the local disaster. It was a single, immense entity, moving with the cold, indifferent physics of a tropical storm. It swept over the final, expensive blocks of the North Division at a terrifying speed, consuming buildings in 20 seconds that had taken 20 years to raise. This was not a fire that crawled. It was an explosion that erased the world. All order was gone. The police were lost in the confusion. The government was nowhere to be found. There was only one primal instinct left among the thousands trapped north of the river: flight. The masses moved as a single organism, a panicked, dark human river flowing toward the only open space left in the entire burning map of the city. They ran toward the frigid, open expanse of Lake Michigan. They clutched their last useless possessions: a heavy trunk, a silver portrait, a child's chair, burdens they would soon discard in the mud. They rushed to the shoreline, only to find the great, cruel irony of the night. Chicago, the city built on a vast, endless sea of fresh water, was about to be destroyed because it could not access the very resource that defined it. The escape route was only a short reprieve. The fire hit the great wooden structures of the wharves and piers with the speed of a striking viper. The lumber was dry, old, and instantly consumed. The docks, the platforms, the boathouses, all caught fire at once, closing off the last narrow avenues of land escape. The tens of thousands of people who had found refuge on the edge of the water were suddenly surrounded. Behind them was the white-hot roar of total incineration. Before them was the black, frigid, infinite depth of the Great Lake. They were trapped on a narrow strip of superheated, burning mud. The cry that went up was not a scream of fear, but a unified howl of ultimate, tragic realization. There was no escape. They were being roasted alive, mere feet from the liquid cold that might offer a chance. The fire advanced across the piers. The structures collapsed, sending waves of flame and sparks over the terrified crowd. Pushed by the ultimate terror of burning, the people had only one path left. They walked, then fell, then plunged into the terrifying, icy blackness of the lake. They traded one death for another, hoping for a final, desperate reprieve. The fire roared, triumphant, over the thousands submerged beneath the waters of their own city. The air temperature over the water was over 100 degrees, but the water beneath was freezing. They were caught in an impossible wedge of elemental cruelty. But the night was only getting started. The fire had not finished its work. It had merely cleared the land, making way for the final, devastating act of the disaster. The wind suddenly shifted. The great engine of destruction paused, not defeated, but turning its attention now to the south. The massive, all-consuming cloud of smoke, ash, and flame now pivoted, driven by a new, violent gale, and began to charge, unimpeded, back toward the main artery of the entire nation, the financial district. And a new terror began to unfold. The fire was now headed straight for the heart of the city, and the city was completely out of water. The great engine of destruction paused, not defeated, but turning its attention now to the south. The massive, all-consuming cloud of smoke, ash, and flame now pivoted, driven by a new, violent gale, and began to charge, unimpeded, back toward the main artery of the entire nation, the financial district. And a new terror began to unfold. The fire was now headed straight for the heart of the city, and the city was completely out of water. This was not a random act of nature. It was a strategic execution. The new wind, a hot, vicious sigh, directed the inferno down the exact path of maximum resistance, toward the ultimate prize. The fire chiefs watched, their faces blackened and defeated, knowing the city's fate was sealed. Their orders were useless. Their horses lay limp, dry snakes in the dust of the avenues. The mighty pumping station, the source of Chicago's lifeblood, had been overwhelmed and consumed hours ago. The reservoirs were drained to the point of silence. The heart of the city's defense had stopped beating, leaving behind only the terrifying promise of total ruin. Down the newly cleared avenue, the colossal fire saw its target. This was not merely a district of wood and brick. It was the very ledger of the American West. Here stood the insurance houses, the major banks, the towering commodities exchanges. These structures, built of granite and imposing iron, were meant to symbolize permanence, credit, and absolute certainty in a chaotic, growing nation. They held the deeds to railroads, the futures of countless farms, the mortgages for half a continent. These heavy vaults were the archive of the nation's promise. If they burned, the financial confidence of the entire United States might burn with them. Panic was no longer a human emotion. It was a physical law. Thousands of clerks and businessmen raced into the district, not to flee, but to salvage some fragment of their financial reality. They dragged heavy, lead-lined safes out onto the cobblestone streets, only to abandon them moments later, defeated by the rising, unbearable heat. They carried ancient, irreplaceable portraits and ledgers, trading the certain death of their possessions for the certain death of their bodies. The air was thick and punishing, heavy with the smell of burning paper, melting copper, and the sharp tang of superheated limestone. They watched, helpless, as the flames, driven by the violent gale, began to leap not across small alleys but across wide avenues, ignoring the careful boundaries men had designed. The great, thick-walled insurance buildings, designed to survive NEM conflagration, were now just the next stage of fuel. The promise of fireproof was an insult to the reality of the hell surrounding them. Iron frames, supposed to be the skeleton of the new city, began to twist and scream as the heat made the metal yield, then flow, then collapse. The last organized defense, the final, futile act of defiance, centered on a proud granite tower, the headquarters of the Chicago Tribune newspaper. Its owners and editors had famously boasted it was impregnable. Its walls were triple thick, its vaults were cast in steel. It was supposed to be the impenetrable barrier. The exhausted fire companies, led by a desperate, failing Will, gathered outside. They had no water left, only picks, shovels, and the hollow echo of their own shouts. The fire hit the near street like an ocean of pure, incandescent heat and began to climb the neighboring structures. Inside the Tribune building, men were still desperately trying to print a final edition, a warning, a history. The final, absurd act of a doomed city. Then the wave of flame reached the outer walls of the Tribune itself. It did not stop, it did not pause. The walls cracked open. The iron support beams within the masonry bowed with a slow, agonizing groan, and the men outside knew the profound, terrifying truth. When the great, promised fireproof tower of the Tribune finally began to sway, not from the wind, but from the thermal death gripping its foundation, a new, terrible sound rose over the relentless roar of the inferno. It was the sound of a city's last hope giving way. The heart of Chicago was now burning from the inside out. The city itself was gone. The only question now was how much of the nation would fall with it. The ground shock from the Tribune's final, grinding descent sent a tremor through the downtown core, but the real quake was psychological. All that remained in the hearts of the exhausted men was a raw, animal terror. The human mind could no longer calculate. There was no defense left to plan, no water to find, no wall left to hide behind. The fire was simply everything now. For hours, the weary citizens and the scattered brigades had clung to one last, impossible hope: the Chicago River. 100 yards of black, cold water. It was the final moat, the definitive break between the central business district and the rest of the waiting city. But the inferno did not respect water. It did not respect gravity. It had become a separate weather system, a colossal thermal cloud. Having consumed all the oxygen in the South Division, the flames reached out with a strange, dark ambition across the 100-yard gap. The first sparks were carried not by wind, but by the fire's own convection currents, a terrifying vortex of heat lifting cinder and burning ash hundreds of feet into the air. They drifted like a deadly, luminous snow, landing on dry, waiting rooftops north of the water. This was not a slow transition. It was an aerial invasion. The new section was the North Division, quiet residential streets, hundreds of wooden homes, vast, tinder-dry lumber yards and coal piles waiting for the winter. The panic now achieved a new, horrifying velocity. The fire had been predictable in the stone canyons of the business district. Here, in the intimate residential wards, it was immediate, personal, and utterly inescapable. Thousands woke to the sound of their neighbors screaming, the incandescent glow already visible through their bedroom windows. They had believed the river was their absolute shield. They were catastrophically wrong. They fled with nothing. No maps, no purpose, only the pure, desperate instinct to move away from the light. Streets that had been quiet, tree-lined boulevards were instantly choked with a desperate tide of humanity. Mothers dragging children, old men pushing broken carts, every carriage, every horse, every wagon pressed into a single, terrifying bottleneck. The city was not just burning, it was running. All roads led toward the only open ground left. All roads led to the lake. Lake Michigan offered a final, freezing trap. A mile-long margin of sand and stone became the last haven. Tens of thousands of people huddled there, breathing air so hot it scalded the lining of the lungs. Above them, the sky was no longer smoke. It was molten copper, alive with the sound of the world ending. They watched the city they knew simply vanish. The great white pine logs of the lumberyards, stacked hundreds of feet high, exploded with a violence that made the air ring like a continuous artillery barrage. Everything was fuel. Everything was consumed. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the city of Chicago ceased to exist as a functioning municipality. The infrastructure that held a civilization together simply evaporated beneath the heat. Police lines broke. Fire command structures dissolved into chaos. Government vanished. The mayor, the chief of police, the city council, they were all now simply refugees caught in the same terrifying stampede, powerless and indistinguishable from the lowest pauper. Authority, like the granite of the Tribune, had bowed. And then a final, cruel truth settled over the freezing, huddled masses on the lakeshore. A silence fell over the continuous, hungry roar of the fire, a sudden hush that was more terrifying than any noise. The waterworks, the great iron heart that pumped life and defense into the city, had finally been breached by the flames. The pipes were dry, the towers were burning, the fire had taken the water, and now the great, endless lake beside them was utterly meaningless. The people had survived the heat, but they were now trapped without a drop to drink, surrounded by an inferno that would rage for another full day. The true nightmare was only just beginning. The pipes were dry, the towers were burning, the fire had taken the water, and now the great, endless lake beside them was utterly meaningless. The people had survived the heat, but they were now trapped without a drop to drink, surrounded by an inferno that would rage for another full day. The true nightmare was only just beginning. The loss of the waterworks was more than a technical failure. It was the final, total surrender. The human fight, the organized struggle against the elemental force, simply ceased. What followed was not a riot or an orderly retreat, but the terrible, instinctive scramble of the animal soul. The thousands of survivors huddled on the lakeshore were no longer fighting the fire. They were fighting a deeper, older enemy. Thirst became the absolute tyrant. They stood beside a freshwater lake the size of an inland sea, yet its churning, polluted water was undrinkable. They were surrounded by the scalding breath of the flames and the freezing cold of the October night, a brutal, simultaneous exposure that broke the body. For a brief, agonizing hour, the fire had nowhere to go but to consume the ruins it had already created. A slow, deep-bellied roar over the smoldering business district. But the city's fate was always determined by its eternal, invisible betrayer, the wind. Just before 3 o'clock in the morning, the gale shifted once more. It took the colossal, singular heat of the now vanished South Division and hurled it across the main branch of the Chicago River. The river, 100 feet of cold, black water, had always been considered the final firewall. It was the geographical demarcation that saved the northern half of the city. The people north of the river believed they were safe. They watched the glow in the south as an unbelievable but distant horror. They were wrong. The fire did not cross the water by bridge or by boat. It crossed on the wind itself. Embers the size of dinner plates, pieces of blazing roof and white-hot wood, carried on a 40-mile-an-hour jet of heat, sailed through the darkness. They fell like meteorites onto the lumber docks, the shipyards, and the dry shingle roofs of the North Division. The river was not a boundary, it was a passage. The first flames to take hold on the northern bank erupted with an instant, shocking violence, leaping up from the docks in an immediate wall of fire. The cry that went up across the North Division was different from the shouts of the previous night. It was a sound of profound disbelief, the moment when the impossible becomes real. The fire was now a hydra, 2 unstoppable heads consuming the city. The people trapped in the northern neighborhoods, many of them wealthy citizens who had delayed evacuation, suddenly had only one frantic common thought: west. Their only escape lay across a handful of narrow iron and wooden bridges connecting them to the sprawling, working-class West Division. The Lake Street, Clark Street, and Rush Street crossings became a scene of human desperation that defies description. It was not a crowd. It was a physical, panicked current of humanity pressing itself across the narrow choke points. Carriages overturned, blocking the path. Horses, wild with terror, broke their traces. Every man, woman, and child was a single unit of raw fear, pushing against the others, against the architecture, against the dying light. Those who could not reach the bridges were forced northward into what they hoped was open prairie. But the fire followed. It did not merely consume block by block. It swallowed whole streets at once, moving with the speed of the wind that drove it. It found the city's landmarks and executed them one by one. The stately mansions along the river, the magnificent churches whose steeples had seemed to pierce the heavens. Each one became a chimney, a magnificent spectacle of destruction before collapsing into a mountain of sparks. The fire was now marching toward the city's heart of recreation and refinement, the elegant hotels, the ornate water towers, and the final, enduring symbol of the city's self-regard. It was moving toward the Palmer House, the largest, most luxurious hotel in Chicago and the most magnificent structure in the West. It was believed to be fireproof, a fortress of limestone and iron. The city had lost its defenses, its government, its water, and its hope. Now it was about to lose its greatest architectural boast. The fortress was about to meet the storm. The Palmer House was the pride of Chicago's new elite, a $1 million monument to ambition. Its walls were thick, its floors tiled, its roof crowned with heavy slate. Architecturally, it was a statement. The city could not only withstand the elements but tame them. Its owner, Potter Palmer, had spent a fortune ensuring its immortality, or at least its imperviousness to flame. The storm did not send scouts. The fire arrived not as creeping smoke, but as a roaring, atmospheric furnace. It did not try to burn through the thick, carved limestone. It simply incinerated the air around it. It started not from the ground up, but in a horrific rain of embers carried by the cyclone wind. They landed on the slate roof, the heavy iron balcony railings, and the tightly shuttered windows. The iron, meant to protect, began to radiate intense heat, transferring the fire's energy directly into the structure's core. A building designed to resist 100 ordinary house fires stood utterly defenseless against an elemental force. It was not a slow consumption. The magnificent hotel was engulfed in minutes, a giant, beautiful pyre against the midnight sky. The fortress had dissolved into ruin. And the fire did not pause to admire its work. It had a destination, a grander symbol of power to vanquish. It was heading for the north side, toward the pumping station, the last source of water, guarded by the great stone water tower. The entire apparatus of the fire department had collapsed hours ago. The men were exhausted, their hoses brittle, their steam engines rendered useless by a lack of access to water, and now no usable water source remained south of the river. The water tower, a sturdy stone sentinel that had pumped life into the city for years, was now the final, desperate hope. Its fate was sealed the moment the conflagration crossed the river's north branch. The wind pushed the flames relentlessly into the lumber yards, the paint shops, and the coal docks. This was not a fire now. It was the ignition of a massive fuel storage facility that happened to be a city. The heat was so intense it shattered windows blocks away. It twisted iron rails and melted the lead from the window sills of buildings that had not yet been touched by flame. As the inferno raged north, a separate, more insidious terror began to spread through the darkness. The flames had reached the city's massive gasworks. When the massive iron storage tanks were breached, the effect was cataclysmic. There were no immediate cinematic explosions, but a sudden, terrifying intensification of the fire's roar, a deep, hungry surge as the flames tapped into an endless pressurized reservoir of natural gas. The sky above Chicago, already an unnatural orange, went from merely bright to blinding. The fire did not just burn, it seemed to feed on the very atmosphere. The city, already choked by smoke and fear, was plunged into a strange duality. The immediate vicinity of the flames was like a second sun, burning with an impossible heat. But blocks away, where the gas lines had been cut or consumed, the world fell into an absolute, primeval darkness, illuminated only by the flicker of the monstrous beast approaching. With the destruction of the gasworks, the panic took on a new, desperate quality. The wealthy citizens and the poor alike, recognizing the fire's indifference to class, streamed toward the supposed safety of the lakefront and the large, open squares. Lincoln Park on the northern edge became the final sanctuary, a vast, open expanse of grass and trees, bordered by the cold, deep water of Lake Michigan. Here they believed the fire could not follow. Tens of thousands of people gathered in the park. They brought their most treasured possessions, piled high, family portraits, silver heirlooms, bank books, and small, locked boxes of jewels. It was a bizarre, temporary city of salvaged wealth and sheer human misery. But the fire did not respect boundaries. The wind, still howling, continued to drive superheated air and massive, blazing fragments of wood and shingle far ahead of the main front. These firebrands, the size of dinner plates, landed deep within the park, on the grass, on the piles of possessions, and on the tents and blankets people had hastily erected. The sanctuary itself began to burn. Panic became delirium. People who had survived the crossing of the river, the collapse of the streets, and the rush through the dark alleys were now faced with the fire igniting their final refuge. They rushed into the lake, standing waist-deep in the freezing water, huddled against the waves, watching the flames con. Soon what was left of their lives on the shore. It was during this period, in the chaotic maelstrom between the Water Tower and Lincoln Park, that the fire performed its most notorious and most symbolic act of destruction. The Water Tower stood, its limestone walls still mostly intact, but the wooden roof of the pumping station it guarded was now fully aflame. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the heavy beams and machinery gave way. A terrible, grinding crash echoed across the roar of the fire. The pumping station was gone, the water pressure dropped to nothing. Chicago was now entirely without defense. It was a city utterly abandoned by the essential lifeblood it needed to survive. The beast was loose, unfed and unhindered, ready to feast for the rest of the night, with nothing left to stop it but the vast, cold emptiness of Lake Michigan itself. The morning would not bring salvation. It would only bring a final, blinding reckoning. The fight was over. The city's greatest weapon had fallen. The men of the fire department, stumbling through the hot, swirling air, saw their heavy lines go slack, their hoses dry and limp on the scorched cobblestones. They had nothing left to battle with but axes and the last, fading embers of desperation. They were witnesses now, not soldiers. The fire knew this. It had achieved critical mass, a self-sustaining storm that needed no further human interference. It fed not merely on wood and brick, but on the raw oxygen of the atmosphere, sucking the air out of the streets and creating its own desperate winds. Across the North Division, the final, methodical destruction began. The mansions and grand estates that had been built with such pride, boasting of permanence and wealth, now became the choicest fuel. These homes, constructed of the finest timber and furnished with heavy, opulent fabrics, created an inferno that dwarfed everything that had come before. Irony was swallowed by the heat. Robust construction meant only a longer, brighter, more terrible burning. The intense, furnace-like breath of the conflagration began to melt the very stones of the sidewalks. The granite and limestone of the wealthy districts crumbled. The iron fences, meant to stand as rigid borders against the outside world, softened until they bent and drooped like clay. It was a terrifying, beautiful spectacle of pure entropy, where matter returned to liquid and smoke in the presence of its master. This was the darkest part of the night, yet the sky was never truly black. It was a fierce, churning red, a vast, swirling ceiling of flame reflected back by the endless soot. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 burnt materials, coal, oil, fine fabrics, and the acrid, metallic taste of total ruin. Then slowly, painfully, the true horizon began to lighten. It was not the soft gold of a welcomed sunrise, but a sterile, unsettling gray that struggled to fight through the monstrous pillars of smoke. 4 o'clock came. 5 o'clock. The fire did not diminish. It merely changed hue, transforming from the frantic, roaring yellow of the deep night to the stark, blinding white heat of the morning. And as the sun finally climbed, a pale, soot-choked disk, it illuminated the unimaginable. Where 3,000 structures had stood just hours before, there was now only a desert. 1,000 acres of smoldering, flat ruin, stretching with shocking uniformity from the river's edge to the shores of the lake. It was a landscape of ash, chimney stacks standing like tombstones, and a vast, unbelievable silence. A silence more profound, more terrifying than the loudest storm of fire had ever been. At last, around 6 o'clock in the morning, the flames had run out of food. They had reached the last line of defense, the sand of the shoreline, and the cold, uncaring waves of Lake Michigan. The fire licked once at the water, and then, deprived of fuel, it died. It was not a victory for the people. It was simply the moment the consumption ceased. The burning had stopped, but the ordeal had not. The city was gone. Now the survivors had to face the cold, empty truth of what remained. They emerged from the parks and the lake and the empty prairie, standing on the broken body of Chicago. They were exhausted, utterly homeless, and freezing in the sudden, damp air of the dawn. The sun was up, the fire was out. And the ultimate question now hung over the gray, smoking ash, a burden far heavier than the smoke itself. How do you begin to rebuild a world that has been so utterly, so completely erased? The answer was not found in blueprints or in distant, sympathetic gestures. It was found in the simple, excruciating act of walking. They did not begin to rebuild a world. They simply retrieved the fractured pieces of their own. The ground was a cruel, hot enemy, still radiating the furnace heat, making standing still an impossibility. Smoke did not rise in the dramatic plumes of fire now, but in thin, ray, lentless tendrils, the deep, cold smoke of lingering decay and endless combustion. The air tasted of iron and wet ash, clinging to the tongue. The noise was gone, replaced by a terrible, amplified silence, broken only by the crackle of still-collapsing brick and the muffled sounds of crying. They were ghosts moving through a graveyard. 100,000 souls were instantly made refugees in their own city. They were the dispossessed, moving with a dazed, primal instinct toward the few untouched patches of prairie, and the south side where the flames, by some miracle, had been stopped. The North Division, a vibrant world of homes, taverns, and industry, had utterly ceased to exist. In its place, only a single, vast geography of destruction remained. 1,000 acres of flat ruin so uniform it defied comprehension. The landmarks were gone. The grand names of the streets, Washington, Rush, LaSalle, meant nothing now, just trenches cut through molten slag and mounds of pulverized stone. Men searched the rubble for the shape of a familiar chimney, a piece of plate, a child's toy, anything that could anchor them to the world that had vanished overnight. The smell was the worst. Not just the sharp, stinging odor of soot, but the sweet, metallic scent of burnt possession, of ruined food, of countless animals, and something darker, unspeakable, that lay hidden beneath the collapsed foundations. The machinery of the city had stopped cold. Water mains were burst and melted. Telegraph lines were reduced to slag and ash. cutting Chicago off from the outside world except by slow, labored railway communication. The seat of government, the courthouse itself, was a molten ruin, its great bell cracked and silent forever, lying on the ground like a useless, fallen idol. There was no law, only need. And with need came a brutal, immediate kind of calculus. General Philip Sheridan, the famed Little Phil from the Civil War, saw the chaos coming before the dazed survivors did. Moving with the speed of a military commander, he immediately declared martial law. Soldiers patrolled the ruins, not to fight the flames, but to guard against the darker impulse of man, the impulse to steal from the dead city, to profit from despair. They were the iron hand of order in a world dissolving into the immediate desperation for survival. The first priorities were not finance or insurance claims, but food, water, and shelter. The world outside Chicago had begun to move, but aid was hours or even days away. And in that vast, empty space where the great Western capital had been, a profound question of identity emerged. Was the city dead, or was it merely sleeping? The men who still held power, the surviving bankers, the rail barons, the meatpacking titans, could not afford a moment of mourning. They met in the one great structure left standing amidst the desolation, the private mansion of Mayor Roswell B. Mason. Their debate was not about cleanup. It was about the future of the entire Midwest. If Chicago faltered now, if it showed weakness, its great rivals, St. Louis, Cincinnati, would consume its title as the Queen City of the West forever. The city had to show strength, not in years or even months, but in the immediate, unforgiving passage of the next 7 days. The battle for Chicago's very identity was about to begin, waged not with fire but with capital iron, and an ambition so stark it was terrifying. The ruins were barely cool, the dead were still being counted, and the first ironclad order was already being given. The great, empty canvas of ash was about to be redrawn, and the decree was absolute. The city would rise again, and it would do so immediately, or it would cease to matter forever. The ash had barely settled on the window ledges of the mayor's makeshift office, but the great clock of commerce had already been reset. Time was no longer measured in hours of sleep, but in loads of stone and iron. It was a terrifying calculus. They were wagering the fate of millions of square miles of the American West against the immediate willpower of a few dozen men in a smoke-filled room. The fire, which had consumed the weak structures and the complacent nature of the city, had simultaneously purified the will of the strong. Defeat was not an option. It was a permanent corporate liability. The bankers spoke first. A city without credit is a ghost, and the first decree was to open a clearinghouse, to prove that Chicago's financial promise had not dissolved with its paper currency. The rail barons followed. A city without rails is a dead end, and the second order was a total reversal of the supply chain. Every sentence was a brutal, self-serving declaration of necessity, cloaked in the language of civic duty. The core of their strategy was simple, elegant, and chilling. They would not wait for federal aid or sentimental sympathy. They would not ask. They would simply take. Across the continent, telegraph operators began to tap out coded messages, messages that traveled faster than the news of the disaster itself. The great arteries of the railroad system, which Chicago had built to serve its destiny, were now called upon to save it. From the iron ore fields of Michigan, from the limestone quarries near Joliet, and from the deep, dark forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota, the call went out. Every available resource, every spare wagon, every mill capacity, it was all requisitioned. Overnight, the greatest industrial supply chain the world had ever seen was reversed. It was no longer about shipping meat out of Chicago. It was about pouring the raw materials of civilization back in. This was not merely rebuilding. It was an accelerated industrial takeover. The men who owned the land, the tracks, and the money had seen their city vaporized, and in the emptiness, they saw only a chance to build it stronger, faster, and more profitable than before. They would rebuild the city not as it was, but as it should have been, a steel-spined, ironclad fortress against fate. But this grand, terrifying plan was waged above the heads of 90,000 people now living under canvas, or worse, sleeping directly on the cold, wet prairie soil. The elite might have the credit, and the titans might have the trains, but nature refused to wait for a balance sheet. The calendar turned to the middle of October. The air, still acrid with the memory of smoke, began to carry a new, sharper scent, the promise of a brutal Chicago winter, a cold that could turn a temporary tent city into a permanent graveyard. The very urgency that drove the Titans to rebuild their banks was, for the refugees, a clock ticking down to 0 degrees. The immediate orders were clear: reconstruct the commercial heart of the city first. The financial district, the Board of Trade, the stockyards, the machine of capital must be revived. Homes could wait. Shelter was a secondary concern to the integrity of the market. And so, an invisible schism began to form across the ashes. The builders of the new Chicago were moving with a furious, unstoppable intent, driving their piles and laying their brick amidst the smoking debris. They would not accept the title of a secondary city. They refused to be a footnote to St. Louis. They would be the capital of the West, and they would do it now. The sound of destruction, the sound of the fire, was replaced almost instantly by the sound of reconstruction. Hammering, the squeal of new steel, the scraping of shovels clearing ash for the next foundation. A profound act of will, yes, but also a declaration of corporate warfare. The foundations of the future were being dug deep into the ruins, but they were not being built on equal ground. A fierce, almost primal struggle for the best plots, the most skilled labor, and the rapidly depleting supply of lumber was emerging. Every foot of cleared land became a contested territory. The fire had erased the city's past, but it had not erased the ruthless nature of its ambition. Chicago was rising, but who, exactly, was going to pay the ultimate price for this terrifying resurrection? The answer would arrive on the first rail car, bringing with it not salvation, but a chilling new kind of chaos. The first trains groaned into the temporary depots, not with blankets or water, but with men. They came from Ohio, from Pennsylvania, from the tired farms of Indiana, drawn by the scent of opportunity and the promise of wages unheard of in the rural silence. They were the reinforcements for the corporate army, the raw human fuel needed to forge a new metropolis. Thousands arrived every week, clogging the burned arteries of the city. The human tide was immense, crushing and completely overwhelming to the broken infrastructure. This was the chilling new kind of chaos, the chaos of desperate, unlimited supply. The ruling elite of the burned city, still meeting in provisional, smoke-scented banks, saw not suffering but an unprecedented surplus. They needed men, yes, but they did not need citizens with rights. The supply of muscle now far outstripped the demand for conscience. Wages that had been steady before the fire were slashed overnight. The desperation of the dispossessed resident merged with the hunger of the new arrival, creating a single, vast pool of exploitable need. The promise of the new Chicago was rapidly becoming a cruel, inverted mirror of the old. The immediate problem was space. Where the stone buildings had stood, a sea of canvas and rough-cut wood now rose. A secondary city, temporary and profoundly illegal, was constructed in the ruins of the first. This was the shadow city, built not by architects, but by the bitter necessity of survival. The shantytowns were named with bitter irony: the Sands, Little Dublin, or simply the Hole. These were not neighborhoods. They were staging grounds for survival, packed with men and women living 3 and 4 deep in structures designed. For one, diseases that had fled the fire now returned with a vengeance, feasting on the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Vice was an immediate, thriving industry. Saloons constructed of salvaged boards and tar paper opened 24 hours a day, offering the only temporary escape from the dust and the crushing poverty. The opportunists who flocked to the fire were now the landlords, the bartenders, and the loan sharks, all operating with absolute impunity beneath the weak, distracted gaze of a provisional government. The rebuilding of the commercial core was a miracle of speed, a triumph of capital and will, but the human reality around it was a moral catastrophe. The architects and the contractors, the men with the deeds and the capital, saw only the beautiful, clean lines of the future in their blueprints. But the men digging the foundations, the ones sweating blood onto the new clay, lived only in the brutal, chaotic present. The ambition of the elite was the force driving the hammer, but the misery of the worker was the true foundation of the new Chicago. Every girder that went up was built on a deliberate system of denial of fair wages, denial of safe shelter, denial of a voice in the new order. The city was not healing. It was simply calcifying its deepest, most violent injustices beneath a layer of fresh limestone and steel. This tension, invisible to the gentlemen in the provisional banks, was a volatile gas seeping up from the freshly laid foundations. It needed only a spark to ignite. And the first spark arrived not in the form of a match, but as a confrontation, a demand that echoed from the laborers' shacks and reached the granite doors of the new Board of Trade. It was a cry for justice, not charity. The powerful men of Chicago, blinded by the beautiful violence of their own resurrection, were about to learn that rebuilding the city was far easier than controlling the anger of the people who built it. The threat was no longer the wind and the wood. The threat was the men with the shovels. The silent army, exhausted and enraged, was beginning to move. The moving was quiet at first. It was not a riot of desperate, immediate rage. It was an organized, devastating withdrawal. The men walked off the foundations and out from under the rising skeletal towers of steel. They laid their shovels down on the fresh, churned earth, not in anger, but in declaration. On a single Tuesday morning, the thousands of hammers that had been the heartbeat of the new Chicago fell silent. The demand was simple, yet in the context of this feverish, unstoppable reconstruction, it was revolutionary, a pause. The fire had demanded nearly a year of 24-hour days, of brutal, unrelenting labor in the dust and the freezing mud. They had built the new Rome faster than any had thought possible. They had done it by sacrificing their bodies, their families, and their sleep to the god of efficiency. Now their tools were down. The demand, echoing across the vacant construction sites, was for the 8-hour day. They were not asking for more wages to feed the engine of capitalism. They were asking for less time, for a sliver of their lives back. They had burned once in the Great Fire. They refused to burn out now, slowly, systematically, for the profit of the men they served. To the architects and the provisional bankers, this was not a social plea. It was treason. It was an audacious disruption to the sacred, unstoppable machinery of rebuilding. These gentlemen, still polishing their silverware in temporary mansions, had been granted a blank slate by God and the west wind. The fire was supposed to have cleansed the city of weakness. These dirty, ungrateful hands were now scribbling all over the masterpiece. The real tragedy, to the elite, was not the destruction of their property in 1871, but the sheer insubordination of their tools in 1873. The city froze. The rising skeleton of Chicago, the very symbol of its unstoppable resilience, was suddenly a monument to its extreme fragility. No brick was laid. No beam was hoisted. The new economy, based entirely on the principle of perpetual cheap motion, shuddered to a silent, terrifying halt. Mayor Joseph Medill, the fiery orator who had begged for international aid after the blaze, quickly stopped talking about Christian charity and began talking only of order. He was not concerned with fairness or exhaustion. He was concerned with the balance sheet. He saw an enemy, a cancer, not a constituency. The official response was immediate and final. The city government decided to use the same methods that had proved so effective in controlling the city's other great scourge, the poor. The call went out to the police. The militia was mobilized. The same uniforms that had failed spectacularly to stop the elemental force of the flames were now repurposed, weaponized, and deployed to crush the social force of demand. The conflict shifted from the construction site to the street corner. It was no longer a negotiation, it was a showdown. Police batons began to swing in the shadows of buildings that were not yet complete. A violent, unspoken declaration that the streets and the land might belong to Chicago, but the time itself belonged to the men with the capital. The powerful men of the city would not concede an hour. They saw the strike not as a symptom of exhaustion, but as an act of pure, unforgivable anarchy. They had decided that the new foundation of Chicago must be built not on limestone, but on submission. The building had stopped. The war had begun. The enemy was no longer an accident of nature, but the deliberate, calculated violence of Chicago against its own heart. The elite was about to teach the city a lesson that would echo through the decades, a lesson that the first volley of the new city's violence would not be a warning shot. It would be a fatal blow. The elite was about to teach the city a lesson that would echo through the decades, a lesson that the first volley of the new city's violence would not be a warning shot. It would be a fatal blow. The fatal blow landed not on the body of a man, but on the concept of time itself. The masters of the rebuilt Chicago saw the 8-hour day not as humanitarian reform, but as a direct threat to the very physics of their power. It was a subtraction from their dominion, an hour pried loose from the 24 they believed they owned absolutely. The clock was their weapon, and the strike was an act of sabotage against the mechanism. This was the ultimate, cold calculus of capital. The life, the sweat, the very breath of a man could be factored and measured, then converted into profit. To grant the 8-hour day was to admit that the machine could slow down, that the workers possessed an agency that transcended the necessity of hunger. This was unacceptable. The police were not deployed to maintain the peace. They were deployed to enforce the clock. The lesson began in the lumberyards, in the dusty, scarred clearings where the new structures were meant to rise fastest. The city's official response did not utilize legal documents or negotiation teams. It arrived with the grim finality of a battalion. The message was immediate and visceral. The law was not on the side of the labor. The law was the force that broke the labor. The officers, hardened by the lawlessness that followed the flames, moved through the crowds with a terrifying, professional indifference. Their initial failures against the fire had been forgiven. Their success against these tired, desperate men would be rewarded. They were repurposed instruments, tools that had been honed on the social violence of the slums and were now pointed directly at the working heart of the reconstruction. The vocabulary of the streets changed overnight. A simple demand for rest became sedition. A peaceful assembly became an insurrection. Every organized discussion, every quiet gathering of men near the building sites was interpreted by the authorities as a planned riot, a premeditated attack against the city's ability to recover. And thus, every preemptive act of official violence was justified before it even occurred. The newspapers, controlled by the very same men who controlled the police budget, reinforced the narrative. The workers were not victims of exhaustion. They were the architects of a second anarchy. They were the scavengers trying to feed on the body of the city that the fire had left half dead. They were not citizens. They were an enemy within. The true war for Chicago had begun, but it was asymmetric. One side wielded the blunt force of the state, backed by limitless money and the unquestioning support of the press. The other side had nothing but the blistered flesh on their palms and the simple, undeniable human right to 8 hours of sleep. The first major confrontation was not an accident. It was selected with surgical precision to serve as a public example, a declaration that the city would not tolerate a single hour of lost production. A group of men, gathered near the newly resurrected stone walls, stood their ground. They believed in the righteousness of their cause. They believed the city had learned compassion. They were fatally wrong. The police moved in formation, batons held low, a dark, heavy wave crashing into a line of weary flesh. The sound that followed was the antithesis of the fire's roar. It was the sickening, sharp crack of disciplined human violence. The men fell not like heroes in a glorious battle, but like tired, broken things, overwhelmed by the sudden, terrifying efficiency of the attack. They had survived the inferno of nature only to be crushed by the cold machine of organized power. The streets of the new city would run red again, not from the accidental violence of flame, but from the deliberate, ideological violence of the powerful against the poor. And as the sun rose over the newly led blood, the men who controlled the banks and the rail lines in the stockyards stood victorious. They had reclaimed the 8 hours. They had won the war for time. They had built the new foundation of Chicago not on stone, but on submission, and they were about to teach the rest of the industrial world how easily a revolution could be smothered. The lesson was complete. The city was finally quiet, and in that terrifying silence, the next great darkness began to stir. The silence they created was not peace. It was the deep, industrial hum of a perfectly tuned machine. The machine was starved for time, and now, having crushed all opposition, it had all the time it could eat. The newspapers, owned and operated by the victors, declared a triumph of order, a purification of the city's soul. The fire, they wrote, had burned away the weakness, and the swift justice of the baton had cut out the cancer. Chicago did not merely rebuild, it was reforged. It was faster, denser, and far more brutal than the old wooden city had ever been. Look at the lines of the new architecture. Not the graceful, measured curves of the eastern cities, but the sharp, vertical thrust of naked ambition. Steel skeletons shot skyward, monuments to the men who had won the war for time. The world had never seen anything like it. These were the first true skyscrapers, built not out of artistry or beauty, but out of the sheer necessity of concentrated capital and greed. Every vertical foot was a declaration of power. We are higher, faster, and we own the horizon. Below them, the ground floors were converted into cathedrals of consumption and commerce, places where a deal could be struck in minutes and fortunes could be made or lost before the midday whistle. This new city was a temple, and its only god was efficiency. But if you looked down, past the polished granite lobbies and the brass elevators, the city still smelled perpetually of smoke. It was the perpetual, oily smoke of the stockyards, the bituminous haze of the mills, and the sulphurous pall of the rail lines. That haze clung to the shanty towns and the sprawling, unmapped continents of the tenement blocks that exploded across the south and west sides. The men who built the skyscrapers did not live in them. They lived compressed, 10 to a room, feeding the endless, grinding hunger of the city's heart. The 8-hour men were gone. They were scattered, silenced, or subdued. But the idea that had animated them did not die. It merely mutated. The broken bones inflicted by the police did not heal. They calcified into a hard, bitter, unyielding resentment. They had seen the truth of their rulers. They understood that the structure of the new Chicago was not merely unfair, it was fundamentally, ideologically violent. The old fire had been an accident of fate, a careless cow, an ill wind. The next fire, they began to whisper, would be an act of will. The city's masters demanded silence, but in the dark, crowded kitchens and the hidden union halls, a new language was being spoken. It was a language of direct action, of final solutions, of anarchy. This new creed saw the state and the powerful elite not as flawed systems to be petitioned or reasoned with, but as criminal structures that must be removed entirely. They moved out of the public sunlight and into the basements, their faith turning away from the slow, broken process of the ballot box and toward the definitive, immediate power of the explosive. The foundation of submission held for a time. 5 years, 10 years. The city pulsed with an almost unbearable, dangerous energy, all the tremendous pressure of 1,000 steam engines confined in a small, tight, unyielding space. The powerful slept soundly in their new mansions, believing the lesson of the baton was final. They believed the poor had learned their place, that the revolution had been smothered and buried. They forgot that every structure built entirely on violence and repression will eventually demand a far more violent response. They had suppressed the rebellion, but they had accidentally and lethally created the anarchist. And in the gathering tension of the spring of 1886, 15 years after the Great Burn, Chicago would finally face the terrifying realization that the fire of 1871 had not been the end of the story. It had only been the match. The immense, heavily loaded powder keg was now about to blow. The fire took everything. It did not merely consume the wood and the brick, it consumed the past itself, the accumulated history held in every cornice and cobblestone. All that was left was 12,000 acres of smoldering, gray desolation, a blank slate purchased with tragedy. The familiar landscape was utterly rewritten by flame. In the smoke, the ghosts of the old city lingered. The shadows of 300 lives and the memory of 5,000 working horses wandered in the ashes, unseen, unheard, a final, chilling echo of the wooden metropole. They haunt the foundations of the skyscrapers that stand today, a constant, quiet reminder that great ambition is often built upon great loss. But the real test came not in the chaos of the burn, but in the profound silence after the collapse. When the final ember had cooled, the question was not if Chicago would rise again, but what, fundamentally, it would choose to become. Would the people retreat, surrendering to the colossal, humbling power of random chance and nature? Or would they look at the empty expanse, at the total absence of structure and see not an end, but an audacious, terrifying invitation? This moment, standing amidst the deep, bone-white ash, was the city's true philosophical birth. They chose steel. They chose height. They chose a future that actively and aggressively defied the memory of the past. The wooden city became a necessary sacrifice, a cautionary tale burned forever into the collective consciousness. The new Chicago, built of stone, iron, and unrelenting ambition, was a declaration of defiance. It stands now, a towering testament to a truth learned in the crucible of that terrible October week, that a city is not its buildings. A city is the relentless, unyielding will of the people who choose to stay in its dust. The fire stripped everything away, only to reveal the true, unbreakable foundation, human resolve, and that, unlike wood, could never be burned.